9 seconds of silence, one word that cracked the air, and over 5 million witnesses to what happened next. In a grand hall built for power, draped in flags, marble, and legacy, they told her she didn't belong. Unqualified. That's the word they gave her. Short, sharp, meant to sting, then silence. But it didn't, because what followed wasn't a protest. It wasn't rage. It was something far more dangerous to those who hide behind status. It was clarity. In that moment, Jasmine Crockett didn't just answer back. She changed the conversation. Not with noise, but with receipts, with names, with dates, with a truth so steady it made arrogance tremble. And it all began here, at a panel where power dressed itself in polish, but didn't expect to be challenged by a woman who'd spent her life defending the unheard. This is where the silence ends, and her story begins. The lights were a touch too bright, sharp and almost surgical, bouncing off the polished white tablecloth that stretched across the panel stage. 5 nameplates, 5 microphones, 5 public faces used to being watched, studied, judged. Behind them, the Grand Seal of the American Forum on Judicial Reform loomed like a quiet judge of its own. The Lincoln Theater in Washington, D.C. had never felt so heavy. Every seat in the House was filled, not just with attendees, but with tension. The kind of tension that buzzes beneath polite applause and stiff blazers. Senators in the front row sat elbow to elbow with civil rights leaders, federal judges next to law students gripping notebooks tighter than necessary. The cameras were rolling. The live stream was ticking. And still, it was like the entire room was holding its breath. The topic was policing and justice. Familiar. Charged. A grenade with no pin, waiting to be tossed. The moderator, well-groomed, practiced, neutral to a fault, posed his opening question with delicate diplomacy. How do we reconcile federal oversight with state autonomy in modern policing reform? It was the kind of question designed not to offend, but to provoke just enough. The kind that asked panelists to dance between sound bites and substance. Pam Bondi spoke first, her voice smooth as varnished oak. She leaned in slightly, not too much, just enough to signal control. We need experience in this conversation, she said. Not hashtags, not headlines. Real, legal experience. Because this issue is too important to be reduced to outrage or emotion. The line was clean, controlled, rehearsed. It wasn't what she said that made the room shift. It was what came next. She turned, fully, her shoulders square. Her voice, still measured but louder now, cut through the air like an indictment. Frankly, she said, I don't think Congresswoman Crockett is qualified to speak on this. There was no gasp. Not yet. But there was a stillness. A crackle in the air so sharp it almost buzzed. It wasn't shock that silenced the room. It was anticipation. The kind you feel when a storm is about to land, and you don't yet know if it'll just rain or uproot everything in its path. Jasmine Crockett didn't move. Not at first, not even to blink. 3 seconds? 4? 9 by some counts. Enough for every person in that auditorium and every viewer behind every screen to shift forward just an inch. Her hands stayed folded, her breath calm. The kind of calm that only comes when you've already seen what the storm can do and decided to walk through it anyway. And that's when the first question began to bloom. Not from the moderator, not from the panel, but in the minds of everyone watching. Who exactly is Jasmine Crockett? And why does a word like unqualified feel like it just hit a nerve deeper than any policy debate? That was the real beginning, because this wasn't going to be a panel. It was going to be a reckoning. The word still lingered in the air, echoing louder in its aftermath than when it had been spoken. Unqualified. It didn't need to be repeated. It didn't need to be shouted. In fact, its potency came from its casualness, the way it was delivered not with fury, but with finality. Pam Bondi had said it like a closing argument, like a curtain drop, like something so self-evident it demanded no defense. But in that pause, in that pregnant, perfect silence, Jasmine Crockett did something extraordinary. She didn't respond. She could have. Any lesser voice might have jumped in, rushed to fill the vacuum with indignation or rebuttal. But Crockett sat there, unmoving, as if the insult had floated past her instead of directly at her. And yet, everyone knew it hadn't. She had been the target, and still she didn't blink. She let the silence bloom, and in doing so, she reclaimed control of the room in a way that no raised voice ever could. There was something unnerving about her stillness, something powerful. It was the stillness of someone who'd stood in courtrooms with verdicts hanging overhead, the stillness of someone who knew the difference between reaction and reckoning. She wasn't just calm, she was calculating. The moderator fidgeted ever so slightly, his smile faltering for a breath as he glanced toward her, unsure whether to move on or intervene. The audience didn't dare cough. Phones remained forgotten in laps. Even Bondi, polished and confident just seconds ago, seemed to shift in her seat, a flicker of uncertainty flashing across her otherwise composed exterior. Crockett finally moved, but only slightly, leaning in toward her microphone, one brow raised in a way that didn't demand attention, but commanded it. Her tone when she finally spoke wasn't defensive or flustered. It was low, measured, precise. "I'm sorry," she began, each syllable unfolding like a loaded question. "What exactly do you think makes me unqualified?" It wasn't just a reply. It was a trap, a quiet challenge designed to flip the power dynamic. It was the moment the crowd realized something was shifting. The temperature had changed, and though nothing dramatic had happened yet, no shouting, no confrontation, something primal was building. Crockett's calmness was not submission. It was strategy. Her silence hadn't been empty. It had been electric. And now, with the weight of the room pressing inward, people began to realize this wasn't a debate anymore. This was a trial. Not the kind with a jury and a gavel, but the kind where truth slices through reputation like a scalpel. The kind where one woman refuses to be defined by someone else's standard. It was subtle, but you could feel it, like a train approaching from far away, the tremble beneath your feet, the low rising hum. Something was coming, and no one, not Bondi, not the moderator, not even the audience, was ready for what happened next. Jasmine Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't lean forward theatrically or gesture wildly like so many on political panels tend to do. Instead, she sat up straighter, let her eyes meet Pam Bondi's for a beat longer than polite conversation would allow, and spoke in the kind of steady cadence that makes even whispered words sound amplified. "Interesting," she said, her tone laced not with sarcasm but precision. "I've tried over 100 criminal cases as a public defender, not from behind a podium, but from beside the accused, often the only person in the courtroom willing to stand between them and a system that already made up its mind." A hush swept through the audience. Not the silence of boredom, but the silence of minds recalibrating what they thought they knew about the woman in the red dress and calm voice. "And," she continued, each word methodically chosen like items in an exhibit laid before a jury, "I've written legislation, real bills, not slogans, not social media posts, passed them, negotiated with people I don't agree with to make sure families didn't lose their homes because of a bail system designed to punish the poor." Her hands remained folded, her voice still even. But something in the room cracked open. The energy had shifted, imperceptibly at first, like the first warm wind before a thunderstorm. A few heads in the crowd began to nod. A senator in the third row lowered his pen. The moderator no longer looked concerned. He looked fascinated. Crockett pressed on. "I came here with receipts, with names, of mothers who called me at midnight, too scared to say their sons' names aloud in case someone heard. I came with the words of teenage boys who told me they feel safer walking alone in the dark than being pulled over in broad daylight." Her voice didn't rise, but it pierced. She wasn't speaking to Bondi anymore. She was speaking to the room. No, to the country, and it was listening. Pam Bondi blinked, expression unreadable, perhaps searching her mental index of prepared comebacks and finding none that applied to what was happening. Crockett was no longer on defense. She was prosecuting, and her case was airtight. "If experience only counts," she said slowly, "when it looks like yours, then maybe that's the problem." The weight of that line dropped like a stone in still water. The ripples reached all the way to the back of the theater, where someone whispered, barely audibly, "She's cooking." That murmur was followed by a few muffled chuckles, not mocking, but reverent. Crockett didn't react. She didn't need to. She had control now. The room had turned. What began as an ambush was becoming a reckoning. What began as an insult was becoming a testimony. And Jasmine Crockett hadn't even raised her voice. Before the panel, before the lights, before the headlines. There was a cramped office on the second floor of an aging brick courthouse in downtown Dallas. The ceiling tiles were stained with time. The air conditioning moaned louder than it cooled, and the hallway always smelled like old coffee and copier toner. The kind of place no one photographs. But this was where Jasmine Crockett learned how power works, and more importantly, how it hides. Her desk was old, its drawers stuck on one side and crooked on the other. The chairs never matched. Her phone rang more often than her name was spoken. But she sat there every day, 5 days a week, sometimes 6, because this was the front line. This was where the system forgot people, and she refused to let it. Her clients were mostly black and brown men. Some teenagers, some barely older than boys. Many came in confused, frightened, worn down before their cases even began. They'd been stopped for driving with broken tail lights, for walking in the wrong neighborhood, for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Many hadn't even been told what they were charged with. Others didn't understand the paper pushed in front of them. They'd learned early on that no one listened when they spoke, so they stopped trying. But Crockett listened. Every time. Even when it was just silence and slumped shoulders, she listened. And they could feel it. That someone was finally willing to hear them without judgment or suspicion. In court, she didn't pace. She didn't shout. That wasn't her style. There were other attorneys who loved theatrics, loved the sound of their own objections, but not her. Jasmine Crockett knew that in a courtroom, the loudest voice often meant the least. Instead, she studied every file, every motion, every line of testimony. She walked into court like a surgeon enters an operating room, with focus, not flair. She let silence do the work for her. A pause after an unfair statement, a long look after a judge's raised brow. And when she spoke, it was with purpose. Her questions weren't dramatic, but they cut deep. Her tone wasn't emotional, but her presence demanded attention. One prosecutor once told her offhandedly, "You're dangerous because you don't yell." She never forgot that. It wasn't a compliment, it was a warning, but Crockett took it as a badge of honor. In a world that expected black women to fit a script, too loud, too angry, too emotional, she rewrote it entirely. Precision became her protest. Calm became her rebellion. And empathy? Empathy became her secret weapon. Because she knew the system didn't break people loudly, it broke them quietly. So she fought back just as quietly. And yet somehow her voice carried. Even then, the courthouse hallways were long, too long. They seemed to stretch endlessly, lined with flickering fluorescent lights and dull beige paint that had long since given up trying to be welcoming. The echoes of hurried footsteps and mumbled conversations bounced off tile floors, mixing with the distant hum of vending machines that no one ever used. Jasmine Crockett walked those halls every day, heels tapping in rhythm with a purpose she never let herself forget. But she knew deep down, these halls weren't built for her. Not for someone like her. Not for a young black woman with a natural twist in her hair and a case folder tucked under her arm instead of a donor list in her phone. She noticed it in the smallest details. The sideways glances from courtroom clerks who assumed she was a secretary, the defense attorneys who mistook her for someone's assistant, the way older white lawyers nodded past her as if her presence were incidental. Judges sometimes raised an eyebrow when she announced her name. Bailiffs offered directions before asking if she belonged there. And when she spoke in legalese sharper than most of her peers, they didn't compliment her skill. They questioned her tone. The racism wasn't overt. That would have been easier to fight. It was the kind that slipped through cracks and wrapped itself around expectations like ivy, quiet, persistent, and suffocating. The gendered expectations came layered on top. Smile more. Don't interrupt. Don't be so intense. She was told, gently, patronizingly, to slow down or soften her delivery, even as she watched male colleagues get praised for the same assertiveness. In committee meetings and courthouse corridors, she learned that being right wasn't always enough. Not when the people in power didn't want to hear it from her. Isolation crept in, subtle and constant. There were few mentors who looked like her, fewer still who understood the weight she carried into every room. The weight of representation, of restraint, of constantly having to measure her words, not just for accuracy, but for acceptability. There were days it almost wore her down. Almost, but it never did. Because she listened to the people no one else heard, to the patterns others ignored. She learned not just the law, but the architecture of injustice, how it was built, where it creaked, and where it could collapse if pushed hard enough in the right place. And in the margins of those long, indifferent halls, she found her fire. It didn't roar. It burned slow, steady, fed by the faces of clients who whispered thank you not because she won every time, but because she showed up, because she believed them, and because in a world that demanded she shrink herself to fit in, she chose instead to sharpen herself to cut through. The decision didn't come in a burst of lightning. It came late at night, after another long day in court, as Jasmine Crockett sat on the edge of her bed, still wearing her shoes, eyes fixed on nothing. She wasn't angry. She was tired. Tired of watching the same young men shuffled through a broken system like disposable paperwork. Tired of arguing with judges who seemed more concerned with calendar flow than justice. Tired of knowing that no matter how precise her motions were, no matter how airtight her defense, she was still playing on a board where the pieces had already been arranged. And it hit her, not like a revelation, but like a quiet truth she could no longer ignore. If the rules don't work, you don't just keep playing. You run for the room where they're written. Texas politics wasn't designed for people like her. It was built for insiders, well-connected, well-funded, well-behaved. But Jasmine didn't have corporate sponsors or inherited networks. What she had were pastors who believed in her, barbershop owners who knew her name, single mothers who had seen her wait hours to speak at a zoning meeting because it mattered to their block. She didn't launch her campaign with press conferences or polished consultants. She started with a clipboard, a walking route, and a message. Justice isn't something you beg for. It's something you fight for, from the inside out. She walked the neighborhoods most politicians only drove through during election season. She knocked on doors that had been knocked on too many times with broken promises. She held town halls in church basements that smelled of old hymnals and fresh coffee. Her campaign posters weren't glossy. Her shoes wore out faster than her voice. And every time someone asked, "Do you really think you can win?" she answered with a story, not a slogan, about the teenage boy she'd defended who cried after his case was dismissed, about the grandmother who brought her sweet tea during a break in trial because, as she put it, "Baby, you look like you're carrying too much." Even with those stories, the doubt didn't disappear. Colleagues rolled their eyes. Donors passed her over. One local operative said to her face, "You're smart, but you don't look the part." She didn't argue. She just got back to work. And when the votes were counted, the headlines had no choice but to catch up. She hadn't just won. She'd shifted something. Not with celebrity, but with service. Not with clout, but with clarity. Her victory didn't come with confetti. It came with a clipboard still in her hand, and a to-do list she'd written the night before. Because for Jasmine Crockett, politics wasn't a destination. It was a weapon, and she intended to use it, not to ascend, but to undo what had been broken for far too long. Pam Bondi's rise didn't require a fight. It required a phone call, or a handshake, or, more often, the kind of polished introductions exchanged in donor galas, where legacy surnames and private invitations mean more than passion or principle. Born into a well-connected legal family, Bondi walked into power as if the doors had always been meant to open for her. Her smile was camera-trained, her cadence press-ready, and her instincts tuned not to grassroots struggle, but to institutional rhythm. While Jasmine Crockett spent her early career dodging systemic tripwires, Bondi's path was velvet-lined and media-lit. Her name first rose to prominence as Florida's Attorney General, an office she inherited more than earned, swept in by endorsements that read more like social club rosters than ideological alignment. From day one, she had the kind of access that doesn't get taught, it gets passed down. Where Crockett had to beg for 30 seconds of attention, Bondi had producers calling her for comment. Where Crockett fought for court time, Bondi was booked for prime time. Fox News, CPAC, fundraising banquets in crystal-lit hotels. These were her arenas. The message was always controlled, the audience always curated. Nothing unexpected, nothing uncontrolled, and never ever anyone in the room who might ask her to explain everything she chose not to see. Her career thrived in places where image outweighed policy. She was photogenic, eloquent, and unwaveringly partisan, a dream for conservative strategists looking for a sharp but safe female figure to put in front of the camera. She became a mainstay on panels, invited to speak on crime, on justice, on family values, terms that were wielded like shields more than principles. But behind the camera smiles and polished sound bites, Bondi's record told a more complicated story. Her office opposed the early release of nonviolent offenders. It failed to hold police accountable in a string of controversial shootings. It even accepted donations from politically entangled sources at suspicious moments, though her statements always brushed these off as coincidence or timing. But these complexities never really stuck to her. She existed within a kind of institutional insulation, what some call acceptable power. She knew how to play the game, and more importantly, how to make sure the rules always tilted in her favor. Even when called out, she rarely answered. She didn't need to. The system was built to protect those who played it well, and Bondi was a virtuoso. When she walked onto that panel stage in Washington, D.C., she didn't expect resistance. She expected another scripted appearance, another evening of curated applause and partisan alignment. She expected to dominate the room, not defend her record. She wasn't prepared for the fire that doesn't come from teleprompters or press teams. She wasn't ready for someone who didn't just memorize the facts, but lived through them. And that, unlike everything else in Bondi's world, couldn't be spun. While Pam Bondi moved through press rooms and donor lounges with practiced ease, Jasmine Crockett moved through community centers with purpose worn into the soles of her shoes. Her ascent wasn't polished, but it was precise. It didn't happen under studio lights or television panels. It happened in courtrooms where nobody watched, where the stakes weren't ratings, but people's lives. While Bondi gave interviews about justice, Crockett fought for it, tooth and nail, across court calendars jammed with forgotten names and rushed verdicts. Her power wasn't handed to her. It had to be earned, case by case, story by story, step by deliberate step. She didn't charm donors over dinner. She listened to single mothers in laundromats. She wasn't profiled in glossy magazines. She was whispered about in housing authority waiting rooms and church parking lots. "She's the one who helped my nephew," someone would say. "She stayed 2 extra hours after court just to make sure we understood the paperwork," another would add. Her reputation didn't grow through headlines. It grew through witnesses, people who saw her show up when no one else would, people who remembered not what she said, but what she did. Even as she stepped into politics, Crockett never pivoted into performance. Her town halls weren't orchestrated for optics. They were raw. She brought policy drafts on crumpled yellow legal pads. She scribbled notes during conversations, not photo ops. Her schedule overflowed not with media hits, but with back-to-back meetings with tenants associations and school district advocates. She wasn't building a brand, she was building trust. And in communities where trust had long been betrayed, that made her something rare, something real. She never sought the spotlight. But sometimes the spotlight has no choice, because when someone continues to show up, continues to deliver, continues to stand firm in rooms built to break them, people begin to take notice. Journalists started calling. Podcasts wanted interviews. And still, she kept her voice measured, her presence grounded. "I'm not here to go viral," she once told a college group. "I'm here to make justice unavoidable." That's the thing about Crockett's climb. It wasn't meteoric, it was methodical. No shortcuts, no backroom deals, no political inheritance. Her only leverage was her record. Her only campaign machine was community. And when doors didn't open, she didn't wait. She knocked harder. She didn't learn to perform for the stage. She learned to own a room, not with volume, but with credibility. The kind of credibility that doesn't flinch under fire. The kind that doesn't wear off when the cameras stop rolling. And on the night she sat next to Pam Bondi on that panel, That credibility walked in with her, quietly, unmistakably, and ready to be tested. It wasn't a televised ambush or a fiery debate. It wasn't a public confrontation played out on the Capitol steps. No. What sparked the fire was smaller, quieter, and far more deliberate. A podcast. Conservative. Modestly produced. A familiar platform where like-minded voices gathered to reinforce ideas that rarely face scrutiny. That's where Pam Bondi made the comment. Seated comfortably, voice smooth and unbothered, she was asked about younger lawmakers pushing back on the traditional justice system. She smiled, that practiced kind of smile meant to disarm before dismissing. Some of them, she said, are theatrical. They know how to get in front of a camera, how to make noise. But real change doesn't come from hashtags or headlines. It comes from experience. And I'm not sure some of these folks want change as much as they want attention. She never said Jasmine Crockett's name. She didn't have to. The host chuckled knowingly, and they moved on. But the implication had already settled like a thin layer of dust across the room. Easy to miss if you weren't looking. Impossible to ignore if you were the target. And Crockett had heard it. Not from the podcast itself, but from a text message 2 days later. "You heard what Bondi said about you?" it read. A link followed, and for a moment she just stared at her phone. She played the clip once, then once more, and then she closed the app and didn't say a word. Not online, not in press, not even to her team. She chose silence, but not the kind that surrenders, the kind that waits, the kind that sharpens. Because Crockett knew what Bondi was doing. It wasn't just a jab. It was a narrative, one carefully crafted over decades. That emotion discredits you, that passion equals immaturity, that if you speak with urgency and heart, you must be compensating for a lack of intellect. It was a familiar tactic. Dismiss the messenger so you can ignore the message. But Crockett also knew something else. She knew that when you respond too quickly, you play their game. And she wasn't here to play. She was here to build something that couldn't be dismantled by snide remarks or strategic smirks. So she watched. She waited. She kept her notes. She collected not sound bites, but facts. She reviewed Bondi's record, court filings, televised interviews, legislative patterns. She wasn't looking for scandal. She was looking for structure, the invisible scaffolding of privilege and policy that Bondi had stood on for years without being questioned. And when the panel invitation arrived weeks later, and her team gently warned, "Pam will be there," Crockett didn't hesitate. She smiled, not wide but sure, and said, "Good. Let's sit side by side." Because she wasn't going to meet Bondi in a podcast echo chamber. She was going to meet her in public, under lights, with witnesses. And when the time came, she wouldn't raise her voice. She'd raise the truth. The green room was colder than expected, the kind of chill that clings to your spine no matter how many layers you wear. The lights from the hallway bled in through the cracked door, casting long shadows across the carpet. Jasmine Crockett sat at a small folding table, her hands resting lightly on a slim, worn manila folder. She wasn't reviewing talking points. She wasn't preparing zingers. She was studying, again. For the third time that day, every tab in the folder marked a case, a quote, a policy decision, or a donation linked to Pam Bondi. Each one underlined, footnoted, and dated. This wasn't prep for a panel. It was prep for a presentation of truth, cold and clinical. Her assistant had offered to get her water, maybe a tea. She declined both. She didn't need comfort. She needed clarity. For weeks, she'd compiled records. Bondi's opposition to clemency reforms, her silence during police misconduct scandals, her legal maneuvers against same-sex marriage, her campaign's coincidental windfalls. Jasmine had watched hours of interviews, not for performance, but for patterns. Pam liked to pivot. She liked to hide power behind politeness. But Crockett had seen it before. The smile that cloaks the blade. The tone that dismisses without ever raising a voice. And tonight, she wasn't walking in blind. She was walking in armed. She wasn't nervous. Not because she expected an easy night, far from it, but because she understood the terrain. This wasn't a courtroom, but it would function like one. The audience wouldn't be a jury, but they'd feel like one. Bondi wouldn't be a defendant, but her record would stand trial. And Crockett, she wouldn't be playing defense. Not this time. The makeup artist knocked politely before entering. Crockett waved her off gently. Just keep the shine down, she said. I want to look real, not polished. That was the point. She wasn't there to perform respectability. She was there to expose comfort masquerading as competence. As she adjusted the collar of her blazer, her mind played through timelines and figures, not to memorize them, but to internalize the rhythm. She wanted every answer to feel effortless, every fact to land with weight, not dramatized, documented. There was a moment, brief but honest, where she looked at herself in the mirror. Not to fix anything, but to remind herself of who was walking into that room. She wasn't the girl trying to be taken seriously anymore. She wasn't the young attorney being talked over in hearings. She wasn't even just the Congresswoman from Texas. She was the reckoning someone else didn't see coming. When the stage manager knocked twice, soft, then firm, Crockett stood, exhaled once, and slid the folder back into her bag. She didn't need to hold it anymore. The truth was no longer on paper. It was in her voice. And tonight she wasn't here to answer questions. She was here to end assumptions. The air in the auditorium was thick, not just with heat or nerves, but with the kind of energy that signaled something was about to rupture. It wasn't loud, not yet, but it was alive. As the moderator turned the question toward Jasmine Crockett, the audience instinctively leaned in. Pam Bondi had already spoken, crisply outlining her belief that justice required structure, discipline, experience. Words that rolled off her tongue with the ease of someone who had repeated them often enough to believe them unchallenged. But now the spotlight shifted, and Crockett didn't waste time on framing. She went straight to the record. In 2014, she began, voice calm, your office filed a brief opposing the legalization of same-sex marriage in Florida, arguing it would cause significant harm to society. The words hung heavy. Bondi blinked once but didn't interrupt. In 2015, not a single officer involved in wrongful deaths of unarmed black men was prosecuted in your state. Not one, despite 3 cases that captured national attention. Despite public outcry, despite evidence. There was no applause, not yet, but the energy shifted. You could feel it, the way stillness can suddenly feel dense. Crockett pressed on, flipping no pages, looking up with every word. In 2016, your campaign accepted a $25,000 donation from the Trump Foundation just before your office opted not to join the lawsuit against Trump University. Public records, all of it. Bondi tried to interject. There were legal thresholds, but Crockett didn't flinch. She cut in without raising her voice. I'm sure there were. There always are, when power protects power. The room exhaled like a collective nerve had been struck. Not an eruption, something quieter, deeper. People began to shift in their seats. Eyes locked in. Pens stopped scribbling. The audience was no longer absorbing a debate. They were witnessing an autopsy. Crockett continued, we don't get to define justice by the comfort it provides those already served by it. Justice isn't a fortress for the privileged. It's a bridge for the unheard. And when you spend a career blocking clemency, resisting sentencing reform, and cherry-picking data to make systems look cleaner than they are, you're not defending the law. You're defending its most selective interpretations. She turned slightly, not to Bondi, but to the crowd now fully engaged, breath caught somewhere between admiration and disbelief. You call my passion performance, she said, but performance is reciting numbers stripped of their human cost. Performance is ignoring the people those policies bury. Bondi sat frozen, flipping through her notes that now seemed less like preparation and more like armor that no longer fit. The moderator didn't intervene. He couldn't. The conversation had moved beyond moderation. It had become something elemental. For the first time that evening, the lines between parties, personas, and political polish disappeared. There were only 2 visions left in that room. One that sought to preserve order, and one that dared to redefine it. Jasmine Crockett didn't pause for effect. She didn't need to. The silence after her last sentence was its own punctuation mark, louder than any applause. But there was still more to say, and she knew exactly how to say it. Her voice was steady, her gaze fixed not on the moderator, Not on the cameras, but directly, deliberately on Pam Bondi. "You call me unqualified," she began, "because my experience doesn't look like yours, because I didn't rise through handshakes and golf course endorsements, because I didn't inherit institutional comfort and call it merit." She leaned forward, elbows resting lightly on the table. "Let's talk about qualification. You think it's about titles and tenure, but let me tell you what qualifies me. Showing up at court at 7 a.m. for clients who never had a lawyer say their name with dignity. Staying up past midnight writing legislation that keeps single mothers out of jail for missed court dates tied to unpaid tickets. Sitting in living rooms with grieving families, not to console them, but to promise I'd bring their stories into rooms where they've never been allowed." Bondi's face didn't move, but her fingers tensed, tapping once against her notes. Crockett didn't flinch. "See, what makes me inconvenient," she continued, "is that I speak from within the wounds this system refuses to acknowledge. I don't abstract justice. I embody the consequences of its failure. And I've learned that people like you don't fear unqualified voices. You fear uncontrollable ones." She let that linger, not as a threat, but as a diagnosis. The audience was no longer spectators. They were witnesses. The mood had shifted, subtly, then all at once. Eyebrows furrowed in thought, arms once folded now slack in laps. It was no longer about left or right. It was about real and rehearsed. And Crockett? She was the former in full force. "I'm not unqualified," she said, voice tightening slightly. "I'm unwelcome to a tradition that prefers silence over truth, that lifts credentials over character, that still treats passion as a liability when it doesn't come packaged in the right skin, the right tone, the right lineage." She breathed in, slow and deliberate. "But that's fine. I didn't come here to be comfortable. I came here to be clear." And that was it. She didn't slam the table. She didn't raise her fist. But in the back of the room, barely audible at first, someone began to clap. Once, then again. A slow, deliberate rhythm like a verdict being delivered. Another joined in, then a few more. It wasn't thunderous, it wasn't explosive. It was respectful, earned. The kind of applause that isn't about performance, but presence. The moderator looked down, his expression unreadable. Bondi remained still, but the room had already moved. It didn't erupt into chaos. It didn't need to. The shift was quieter than that, but more powerful because of it. The kind of shift that doesn't scream. It hums, a vibration, a crackle in the air, as if something unspoken had just been said aloud for the first time, and no one quite knew what to do with the echo. The slow clap faded, but it left a residue. People didn't rush to stand or cheer. They absorbed. And that was more dangerous than noise. It meant they were listening, processing, reconsidering everything they thought they knew about the dynamic playing out on stage. Then it started. Off stage first. A faint buzz from the press row. Reporters typing faster. Podcasters whispering into headsets. Phones being raised at angles. Their screens glowing. Live streams suddenly flooding social platforms. Texts flew out like sparks from dry wood. "She just dismantled Bondi. You watching this? This is going viral tonight." The official live stream chat overflowed with emojis, reactions, all caps, disbelief. But inside the theater, it was still eerily reverent, electric. The kind of stillness that only happens when a crowd realizes it has just witnessed something it didn't expect, and might not see again for a very long time. Pam Bondi sat stiffly, one hand frozen above her folder, as if flipping another page would make a rebuttal appear from thin air. Her practiced calm had frayed, ever so slightly, visible only to those who knew where to look. Tightened shoulders, a clenched jaw, a glance not at Crockett, but past her. The moderator glanced at the clock, then back at the room, clearly unsure how to proceed without disrupting a moment that had already taken on a life of its own. But Jasmine Crockett, she moved as if nothing had happened at all. No smirk, no glance around the room seeking affirmation, no fist pump or triumphant nod. Just quiet efficiency. She reached for her notes, calmly stacked the papers, placed the pen exactly where she'd found it. Her water sat untouched. She rose with the same quiet poise she had entered with, adjusting her blazer like it was just another day, just another room. If she was aware of the wildfire she just started, she didn't show it. And maybe that's what made the moment more powerful. She wasn't performing. She was finishing. To her, it wasn't a battle. It was a closing argument. The end of a long line of cases where people doubted her, dismissed her, tried to box her in. And just like those trials when her job was done, she packed up. Not because she was finished speaking, but because she'd already said what needed to be said. She walked off stage without looking back, while behind her, the audience didn't clap. Not yet. They were still frozen in the weight of what they had witnessed. And somewhere in that quiet, beneath the blinking screens and scattered breath, you could feel it. Something had changed, and it wasn't going back. By the time Jasmine Crockett reached the parking lot, the internet had already started to ignite. The clip, 57 seconds of her calmly unraveling a narrative that had long gone unchallenged, hit TikTok before she even took off her mic. It was reposted with captions like, "She brought the facts. This is how you answer without yelling," and simply, "Watch this to the end." Within an hour, it had 300,000 views. By nightfall, it had crossed 1 million. But numbers weren't what made it extraordinary. It was the reaction. In a bedroom in Topeka, a 19-year-old girl sat in front of her phone, tears streaking down her face. "She didn't let them erase her," she whispered, voice cracking mid-sentence. "They tried to call her less. They tried to dismiss her, and she didn't flinch." Her video was raw, shaky, unfiltered, and it was shared over and over again. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was true. The truth of being interrupted, overlooked, condescended to. Of being told your voice is too loud, too emotional, too unqualified. Jasmine Crockett had just stood in that fire and hadn't moved an inch. In a middle school classroom in Columbus, a teacher printed out one of Crockett's quotes. "I'm not unqualified, I'm inconvenient." She taped it to the whiteboard. That morning, she used the clip to open a discussion with her students. Not about politics, but about presence. About what it means to speak clearly in a room that was never built to hear you. About how courage doesn't always come in the form of raised fists, but in unwavering tone and irrefutable facts. At a barbershop in New Orleans, older men watched the clip on loop between customers. At first, they nodded in quiet approval, but by the third replay, they began speaking over it, not in critique, but in praise. "That's how you do it," one said. "No yelling, no cursing, just clean truth." Another chimed in. "She didn't back down. She let the truth speak for itself." That's a courtroom queen. It wasn't just the people who already believed in her who were watching. Conservative pundits scrambled to reframe the moment, some calling it performative, others questioning her tone. But the clip betrayed their spin. Crockett hadn't shouted. She hadn't mocked. She hadn't even raised her voice. She had shown her work, and people recognized the difference. That was why it spread, not because it was viral content, but because it was vindication. For young women told they were too much, for Black professionals told they were too emotional, for anyone who had ever been asked to prove they belonged in a room they'd already earned their way into. Jasmine Crockett didn't just speak for herself that night. She held the door open behind her, and millions saw it. 3 days after the panel, Jasmine Crockett walked into a small community center on the east side of Fort Worth. No press vans lined the curb, no live streams, no stage managers or carefully timed applause. Just a folding table at the front, the scent of fresh coffee, and rows of metal chairs packed wall to wall. Teachers, barbers, nurses, retired veterans, young mothers with tired eyes and arms full of toddlers, all of them had shown up, not for a political appearance, not for a viral soundbite, but for her. She didn't take the microphone right away. She stood at the back of the room for a moment, just watching. The rustle of jackets, the cough of someone clearing their throat, the sound of chairs creaking under lived weight. It was all familiar. This was the texture of the community she came from, the ones that had carried her here, the ones that never made the headlines but lived at the center of everything that mattered. When she stepped forward, her voice didn't rise above the noise. It moved through it. "Anybody in here ever been underestimated?" she asked. Hands went up. A few people chuckled, low and knowing. She nodded slowly. "Yeah," she said. "Me too." The room stilled. She didn't offer statistics or policy in that moment. She offered truth. They told me I wasn't polished enough, that I should tone it down, that I didn't come from the right law school, the right zip code, the right pedigree. She paused, letting the words settle. But they didn't see what I came with. I came with memory, with fire, with people like you in my corner. A woman near the back whispered, "Say that." Crockett smiled gently, but not for show. When they called me unqualified, she continued, they weren't just talking to me. They were talking to every person who's ever had to prove they deserve to be in a room they already earned. She looked out across the sea of faces. No stage lights here, just eye contact, real and piercing. I'm not interested in being invited to their table, she said. I'm here to remind you, you can build your own table. Lay it brick by brick. And when you speak, don't whisper. Don't ask for space. Speak so clearly they can't pretend not to hear you. Applause came slowly, not eruptive but honest, not performative but grateful. Someone stood, then another. But Crockett didn't bask in it. She closed her notebook softly and said, we've got more work to do, and it starts right here. No viral moment followed, no headlines the next morning. But every person who left that room carried something in their chest they hadn't walked in with. And that was the real win. Not the clapback, not the coverage, but the quiet return to the place where conviction becomes community and truth becomes movement. The headlines didn't stop. The clips kept rolling. Hashtags trended for 3 days straight. News anchors debated her tone. Social media flooded with edits of her sharpest lines layered over orchestral music. But Jasmine Crockett was already gone. Back in Texas, back in her office, back in the kind of silence that makes the world seem louder by comparison. Her phone buzzed every few minutes, blinking with invitations she never asked for. Cable interviews, op-ed requests, speaking engagements, CNN, NPR, MSNBC. A call from a late-night show producer who said, we'd love to have her read the transcript live. It's powerful TV. But she didn't respond. Not out of arrogance, out of clarity. Her assistant peeked into her office gently, holding a clipboard filled with highlighted slots. You sure you want to pass on all of these? She asked, not pushing, just wondering. Crockett glanced up from a legal pad, where she had been sketching out notes for an upcoming housing rights bill. Her pen paused mid-sentence. Yeah, she said softly. If I say too much, they'll stop listening. The assistant didn't ask what she meant. She didn't have to. Crockett had always believed in the weight of silence, that once a moment does its work, it doesn't need to be explained to death. It needs to breathe, to settle, to turn from spectacle into substance. And she knew the news cycle. Today's warrior was tomorrow's caricature. Speak too often and you risk becoming background noise, reduced to a clip instead of a cause. No, this wasn't the time to ride the wave. It was time to steady the ground beneath it. So she stayed in her routine. Court visits, office meetings, phone calls with organizers, quiet strategy sessions with policy researchers. Her days looked the same as before the panel. Deliberate, full, unseen. But something had changed around her. People stopped her in grocery stores. Young interns walked past her office door twice just to catch a glimpse. A janitor at City Hall left a sticky note on her desk one morning. You spoke for all of us. She kept the note in her drawer. Next to it was a dog-eared folder, her own copy of the Bondi research, still paper-clipped together, still marked with red pen. She didn't throw it away, not because she wanted to relive the moment, but because it reminded her what happens when you come prepared not to perform, but to reveal. That week, while the rest of the country debated her media strategy, Jasmine Crockett quietly met with a group of high school seniors about youth incarceration rates. No cameras, no press release, just one young woman sitting at a table, listening more than she spoke, letting the moment settle, letting the truth land without applause. Because some truths don't need to be echoed. They just need room to echo on their own. The mornings in her office were always quiet. The kind of quiet that came before the weight of the day began to pile in. Emails, appointments, policy calls, staff check-ins. But for a few minutes each morning, Jasmine Crockett allowed herself the stillness. No news notifications, No political chatter, just the soft hum of the ceiling light and the comfort of being alone with her thoughts. From her desk, she could see the wall that grounded her. It wasn't large, but it held three things, each carefully framed, each telling its own story. The first was her law degree. The parchment, slightly faded now, held her full name in bold serif font. It was the first thing she ever hung in the office. Not because it was flashy, but because it was proof, not to others, to herself, that the voices that once told her she wasn't smart enough, not composed enough, not professional enough, had been wrong. Next to it was a photograph, her swearing-in ceremony as a congresswoman. In it, her right hand was raised, her expression composed but unmistakably fierce. She wasn't smiling, not out of coldness, but purpose. That photo marked the moment she walked into a system that was never designed for her and decided to change it from the inside out. But it was the third frame that held the most weight. It wasn't glossy, it wasn't printed. It was a handwritten letter on lined paper, folded into quarters and carefully preserved behind glass. It came from a young man she had defended years earlier, barely 18 at the time, accused of possession with intent to distribute. The evidence was thin. The circumstances were cruel. She had fought harder than she was required to, not because it would look good on her resume, but because he deserved it. The letter wasn't long. The handwriting was slanted, the ink slightly smudged. But every word landed like truth. You believed in me when I couldn't explain what happened. When nobody else wanted to hear it, you listened like it mattered. That saved me. She had read it dozens of times, but some mornings, like this one, she let her eyes rest on it longer. It reminded her of something no viral moment could ever replace. That applause fades, but people remember when you stood beside them. The degree told her she could enter the room. The photograph told her she belonged in the fight. But the letter, that told her why she stayed. It was never about climbing higher. It was about reaching back, about remembering that every time she stood behind a podium or across from a polished face trying to diminish her worth, she carried with her the voices of those who had no platform, no mic, no title, only the hope that someone like her might listen. And that was enough. More than enough. The high school auditorium in Tulsa smelled faintly of waxed floors, pencil shavings, and the unmistakable tang of cafeteria pizza lingering in the corners. Rows of collapsible chairs stretched across the gym floor, most already filled with 9th and 10th graders shifting in their seats, some whispering behind hands, others thumbing quietly through phones. There was no banner announcing her name, no cameras set up in the aisles. This wasn't a campaign stop, and Jasmine Crockett had made that clear from the start. It was a favor to an old professor who now taught government here, who had called and said, "These kids need to hear from someone who didn't start with a silver spoon." She walked onto the stage in a simple blazer and jeans. No podium, no speech papers in hand. Just her. A few kids in the front row straightened up when they realized who she was. One leaned over and whispered, "That's her." The one from the clip. But Crockett didn't open with the moment that made her famous. She didn't quote herself or offer statistics. She stood still, hands relaxed at her side, and asked, "How many of you have ever been told to stay in your place?" A few hands went up slowly. Some heads nodded. The room quieted. She smiled, but only slightly. "I have too," she said. "More times than I can count. When I was your age, I had a professor tell me I was too emotional to be taken seriously in law. Suggested I look into public relations instead." A few audible gasps broke the silence. She gave it a moment. "I thanked him," she continued. "Then I made the dean's list 4 semesters in a row." There were chuckles now. More than a few students straightened in their seats, eyes locked in. This wasn't a lecture. It was a conversation. See, what I've learned is that some people will always try to shrink you down so they can feel taller. They'll try to box your brilliance into something they can name and manage. But here's the truth. You don't need permission to be excellent. She let that line sit, not rushed, not shouted, just steady and certain. A boy in the 3rd row raised his hand, unsure. "But what if they still don't listen?" he asked. "Like, even if you prove it?" Crockett nodded. "Some won't," she said honestly. "But the ones who need to hear you, they will. And they'll remember. So don't waste time shouting to be seen. Show your work. Let it speak when they won't. By the time she finished, no one fidgeted. No one whispered. The auditorium for the first time felt completely still. When she stepped down from the stage, a girl in the back stood up quietly and said, "You didn't just talk. You showed us how to fight back." And Jasmine Crockett smiled, not for applause, but for something better. Recognition. For years, qualified had been a word with a gate wrapped around it, a word that lived in boardrooms and resumes, wrapped in Ivy League crests and padded with institutional titles. It meant connections, tenure, a clean media profile, and most of all, it meant being palatable to those who already held power. But Jasmine Crockett didn't fit that mold. She had stepped into the national conversation from courtrooms, not green rooms. Her experience wasn't rehearsed, it was earned. And when the lights hit her on that panel stage, she didn't ask to be seen. She demanded to be understood. In the days following the panel, op-eds tried to reframe what had happened. Some called her performance impassioned but unpolished. Others questioned whether she was too aggressive to be taken seriously in elite policy circles. But none of them could make the facts disappear. None could unring the bell of her words. And none could undo the image now cemented in the minds of millions. A woman standing her ground with unwavering calm, reshaping the very language meant to exclude her. Because what Crockett had done, quietly, methodically, without ever raising her voice, was redefine what it meant to be qualified. She turned the word inside out. Being qualified wasn't about sitting on panels or holding press credentials. It was about being battle-tested in courtrooms where justice came with a price. It was about being community-driven, not because it looked good on a campaign flyer, but because she'd held the hands of those failed by the very systems others claimed to defend. And most of all, it was about being ethically grounded, choosing truth over optics, accountability over applause. That new definition didn't just apply to her. It echoed in every young woman watching, every overlooked professional told they were too bold, too honest, too real to rise. Crockett became more than a name. She became a mirror, reflecting back the silent potential in people who had never been meant to take the mic, much less the stage. She didn't just speak for them. She reminded them that they had always been qualified. The system just refused to recognize it. And maybe that was the real power of her moment. Not that she won an argument on national television, but that she broke the frame entirely. She forced the country to stop and ask, who gets to decide what experience counts? Who gets to measure worth? And what if, just what if, the people we've been calling unqualified are the very ones who've been carrying justice on their backs all along? Crockett didn't just answer the insult. She rewrote the question. Long before she ever held office, Jasmine Crockett had already learned how to stand alone in a room that wasn't built for her. Not with volume, not with theatrics, but with facts, with resolve, and with the quiet kind of fury that only comes from watching injustice up close. For her, the courtroom was never just a workplace. It was a battleground. And though her weapon was the law, her armor was something heavier, memory. Every time she stood before a judge, she carried more than just a client's file. She carried the stories of mothers whose sons had been caged for mistakes others were allowed to outgrow. The voices of teenagers who never finished high school because a single bad decision was turned into a lifelong sentence. The prayers of grandmothers who lit candles in living rooms while their grandsons waited behind bars for trials that kept getting postponed. These were not footnotes. These were her fire. That's why when she finally entered politics, she didn't trade in her courtroom instincts for polished talking points. She brought them with her. She didn't speak in vague generalities or party-approved language. She spoke like someone who had seen the cost of broken systems and refused to let those costs be ignored. Her colleagues in committee rooms sometimes mistook her focus for coldness, her precision for aggression. But Crockett wasn't there to make people feel comfortable. She was there to make injustice feel exposed. In a world where many lawmakers speak in abstractions about policy, reform, budget lines, Crockett speaks in names, in stories, in the specifics that force people to look beyond headlines and see the actual lives crushed by bureaucratic convenience. And when she enters a room, whether it's a courtroom, a press panel, or the House floor, she never walks in alone. She brings them all with her, The kid who asked if he could finish school from juvenile detention? The woman who missed her court date because she couldn't afford a bus ticket? The families who learned the hard way that justice delayed is justice denied. She doesn't recite their pain. She honors it by making sure the people responsible for shaping laws can't hide behind distance. She narrows that distance, forces the policymakers to feel the heat of the policies they've crafted. Because Crockett knows what many forget. You don't need to shout to shake the room. You just need to bring the truth and be willing to carry the weight of the unheard. She's more than a politician. She's a translator of pain, a strategist of equity, a warrior with a briefcase instead of a sword. In every room she enters, she drags justice to the center of the table and refuses to let anyone look away. When the noise fades, when the hashtags settle, the applause dies down, and the cameras move on. What remains is what was real, not the viral moment, not the headlines, but the truth spoken in a room that once tried to silence it. Jasmine Crockett didn't set out to become a symbol. She set out to do the work. But somewhere along the way, her refusal to flinch in the face of dismissal became something larger than herself. It became a message, etched not in policy briefings, but in the minds of people who finally saw someone stand their ground with grace sharpened into steel. She never chased the spotlight, but when it landed on her, she held it steady, long enough for others to see themselves inside it. And when she spoke, she didn't just defend her experience. She elevated it. She wrapped her words in history, in the voices of the overlooked, in the quiet anger of communities too often muted by systems that praise professionalism while punishing truth. And from that moment, in that chair, with her voice low and unshaken, came the line that echoed long after the panel ended. Know your worth, speak your truth, and when they try to silence you, answer with evidence. It wasn't just advice, it was instruction. For the teenager unsure if their voice matters in a classroom where no one looks like them. For the working mother being talked over in meeting after meeting. For the advocate who's been told to wait their turn. It was permission to speak clearly, to stand firmly, to refuse to be erased. Because what Crockett proved that night wasn't just that she belonged. She proved that the people she represented, the dismissed, the discredited, the disqualified, had always belonged. The system simply hadn't made room for them yet. And maybe that's what makes her story matter most. Not that she won a moment, but that she turned that moment into a mirror for anyone who's ever questioned their own strength simply because someone else couldn't recognize it. Her story isn't about proving herself to power. It's about redefining power altogether. In the quiet that followed as the headlines moved on and the microphones turned toward newer stories, Jasmine Crockett went back to work. She didn't hold a victory tour. She didn't chase interviews. She picked up her pen, walked into her next town hall, and listened, just like she always had. Because she knew what many still hadn't learned. Real power doesn't yell. Real power doesn't chase validation. Real power doesn't flinch. And neither did she. Some stories don't ask for your attention. They claim it, not through spectacle, but through the quiet force of truth long suppressed. Jasmine Crockett's journey is not about political victory. It is not about revenge or rebuttal or redemption. It is about remembering that in every room built to exclude, there are always those brave enough to walk in anyway. Her story reminds us that power is not inherited. It is not granted by credentials or conferred by status. Real power is cultivated through pain, through perseverance, through the sacred act of refusing to disappear. In a world quick to define people by their polish, Crockett reminded us that lived experience is a qualification no institution can fabricate and no opponent can erase. We do not share this story as an endorsement of ideology, but as an elevation of integrity. The names and events recounted here speak not to partisanship, but to principle. That clarity is a form of resistance, and that silence, when chosen with intention, can speak louder than rage ever could. To those who have been told to wait their turn, to shrink their presence, to soften their fire, this story is for you. You do not need permission to be excellent. You do not need legacy to be legitimate. The battlefield may change, from courtroom to classroom, from panel to pavement, but the fight for dignity is eternal. Carry your truth. Sharpen it gently. Speak it fiercely. Because when the world leans in to silence you, stand taller and let them hear the evidence. Thank you for staying till the end. Your time, your heart, your presence matters more than you know. If this story spoke to you, speak back. Like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Let's keep this conversation and this fight alive.